response and restoration. He manages the emergency response program, which includes scientific support to all oil and chemical spills. And he oversees NOAA's Disaster Response Center and is the primary federal trustee. His damage assessment and restoration program is responsible for assessing damage under the Clean Water Act, CERCLA, and the Oil Pollution Act. And he has a whole bunch of other lists, which we can go on and on and on. But I did ask them to share a fun fact, and one of his fun facts is that he has a quote in the George Bush Memorial Library on his Fishing for Energy project, and he bowled in the White House in his younger days and was on a TV bowling show in Philadelphia. So, without further ado,
we could talk about that.
Westerholm.
Thank you. So, I do apologize that I have to step out after my speech for a little bit. I'll try to come back to the end of the workshop. But rest assured there are a lot of individuals within this room that work in my office, and they'll be able to answer additional questions, including Paige, who'll speak after I speak specifically about operational science and the role of the scientific support coordinator during spill response. But I told Monica when she invited me to speak that I would kind of bring it back up to a high-level policy type. Where does science fit in at the larger level? Maybe if you think about the Beltway of Washington, D.C., regulations, policies, laws, and fundamentally how that translates down to the field and ultimately the work that we do. And make no mistake about it, I'm very passionate about science, and I think that it's incredibly important that we make our decisions on rational science. But as we have seen in other cases, not all decisions are made totally on science, and so how do we then, at that higher level, integrate some of the lessons that we're learning now, the lessons from Deepwater, the lessons specifically that many of you in this room have heard me talk about before, of all the research that we did for the natural resource damage assessment. It would be a shame to not incorporate that into our future response decisions. And when I say response, and for some, I apologize to those who will hear part of the keynote that I'm going to give tomorrow. I'll go a lot more in depth. Today it's going to be very superficial. But I do want to talk a little bit about when I say response and what I mean by the continuum response, the type of people that might be involved and what's driving those people from a higher level or their purpose out on the spill, and then where that science plugs in at a very high level, and then we'll pass it off to Paige. I'll leave a little time for questions and answers. But when I say the continuum response, I'm looking from the very beginning, that planning stage, up through preparedness, which would include exercises and training, the actual operational response, and then recovery and/or restoration. And what drives us from a very national level is each of those areas have some requirement in law and regulation and policy. So if you look at planning, industry is required to have plans for how they would deal with a spill response. The government's required to have plans for how they would deal with a spill response. The government and industry are both required to exercise those plans through regulations emanating from the Oil Pollution Act and Clean Water Act. And then when a response comes, it's very clear as to the authorities of the federal government, the state, tribes, responsibilities of industry, and then other people that might be involved in that spill. And within that, there's a lot gauged on prevention, a lot gauged on safety of operations, but where does science fit in? And we're very fortunate over time to have the federal response agencies understand that importance of where science engages into the unified command and where it's important. And Paige again will speak about her role as scientific support coordinator. But just at a very high level, that's just not NOAA science. That's a coordination of all science that could be brought to the challenges that we might face in a particular spill. Then after that operational phase is over, my office and other federal trustees are responsible for doing a damage assessment and then ultimately using any money that's recovered from that damage assessment to restore the environment back to that pre-spill condition. And again, for people who might have questions about that, I'd be more than happy to answer those during this week. But one of the key things about Deepwater Horizon, more so than any other spill in the past, is the amount of research that was done and the amount of information that has come back to us that in some cases we've been able to incorporate, in some we haven't. And then speaking to that, and Monica really alluded to this, her role in the role of Sea Grant and outreach, but additionally, the amount of research that was done under GOMRI funding, the amount of research that industry has poured into doing research post Deepwater Horizon, the government, several of the agencies here in this room that have put research in the last couple of years, and then the damage assessment research, all has been put out. A lot of it has been in peer-reviewed, published publications. Some of it hasn't. But how do we incorporate that? How do we blend that? How do we then move that from the practical information that we're getting out of research back into changes of policy, changes in response operations, changes in our planning structure? And Monica did talk a little bit about dispersants, but that's one area where there's a real challenge of taking all the information that's been gathered on dispersants, the use of dispersants, the impact of dispersants, and then what role that will play in future operations, in future planning, in pre-approvals. And so I throw that out there because you'll hear more discussion this week about it, but really it gets back to how do we change, if we are going to change, some of the things that we're doing. So let's take a step back, and I'll revert back to sort of the Washington, D.C. Operations and say, if we're going to change anything that is currently required, that may be potentially a regulatory change. Now, I see some of my friends from EPA in the back, and they've looked at that very issue of what might be updated. That regulation is still pending. It may come out in 2018. If it does, then that changes what the requirements would be. But until that time, we're kind of operating under the same regulatory regime that we did prior to Deepwater Horizon, with the exception of those regulations that BSEE has put out with respect to their plans for offshore operations and some of their requirements for exercises, and certainly some of the safety requirements. I'll go back again too and say that probably no large-scale spill that will occur in the future will be immune to both local, state, and federal politics. I think we saw in Deepwater, we've seen not just in Deepwater, but a number of natural disasters that the White House takes a personal interest in what's going on, and they look at it through the lens, through a very political lens. Not that they're not trying to do what is right by the American people and respond to the event, but they're also looking at it from what does this mean in terms of our actions with respect to how the people might be viewing potential re-election. And local politicians do the same, state politicians do the same, and I will make a sort of a nonpartisan comment, but one that I think people would agree, is that the more polarized the politics are, the more challenging it may be when this information comes out, as if one party uses or looks at it differently than another party, and then what does that clash mean to people who are operationally trying to do a good job of response. And I think that that's one that isn't going to go away in the near future. We saw a lot of it during Deepwater. We've seen some in very smaller scale responses since then, of an interest that people are doing the right thing. And I then go back and say, well, how does science fit into that? And I've challenged a lot of my staff, and in fact, there's Lisa in the back. Lisa DePinto, who was chief scientist for our natural resource damage assessment, and moved her to chief scientist for my whole office to kind of bring that message, because I think, and I'll leave this thought with you before we go into some questions, I think it's critical that we get this science and get the information out before an event occurs, before the next event occurs, before there are questions, because to be able to argue it during the time and face the social media blitz of different information coming out, some misinformation, some not based on facts, is really incredibly challenging. And I think that it's our job, and I see this once our new administration is in place at NOAA, to go forth and inform them about what their roles and responsibilities will be in a large-scale event, and how we bring science into it, and how those decisions are made so that when the time comes, the best available science and tools can be used for response. I think there's a fear that I have that we may actually get to a point where someone may not take a particular action, even though that action may be the most appropriate, because there's a fear of the unknown, and that because we don't know all the answers, then we shouldn't take that particular action. If you think about dispersants or burning or any sort of action to protect a particular species versus one versus the other, you don't want that. You want that based on the fact that you're using the best science to make the decision, not necessarily a fear or politics to make that decision. And how do you do that? You got to get out in front of that. So I think, if I've kept to my time,
Yes, you have.
I will leave you at that.
I understand.
I don't understand either. My phone's telling me that Siri, I'm telling you. but let me just do a little prelude for tomorrow, a little advertisement for tomorrow's keynote, because I won't go too much into the history response. I think history of oil spill research. I think we've all seen those ups and downs. We've seen since Deepwater the amount that's gone into it. We saw a big blip after Exxon Valdez. Those intervening years, and there we are. This is where we are now. There's less money being put towards research, and I think that's not uncommon that we go through those cycles. So we should capitalize on them when we can and do what we can. But we will continue to do that. The second piece I'll talk about are the people that might be involved. And today I kind of focus on the high-level policy, but tomorrow I'll specifically talk a little bit more about the people that might be engaged right at that scene. I didn't really bring up the media and their role today. I didn't bring up the lawyers and NGOs, but all play a critical part. And how science fits into that operational activity, if you just think about it, there's some roles that may have some liability concerns based on what that action is, and where those academic researchers fit in. There's some times on both industry and on the government side, when we're doing a natural resource damage assessment, that the scientists that are going to be utilized have to be prepared to argue that case in court, and will be under some sort of non-disclosure agreement at the time as they go through that research. The research and facts are put out there, but their particular case position. So those are some of the actions we're going to talk about. And then at the end, as I set up the panel that's going to be talking tomorrow, we'll talk about dispersant use, some additional research funding. Where's that money going to come from? And the West Bill Library Trust Fund. How do we encourage academics in a college institution or university to be part of a process when there may not be a tangible benefit for them to being part of that process? So there's some really good questions. That's just the snapshot, a prelude, but I would be happy to take any questions from the audience or online right now.
Anybody have any questions? I'm stunned them.
It was Siri.
Not right now?
No?
Okay. Well,
Catch me. I'll be here all week.
yes, thank you.
Thank you.
If we can thank him. So our next